Jews have an unsurprisable soul. I discovered that evening in 2002 that my daughter should experience anti-Semitism in the 21st century in London. I discovered I have a surprisable soul. And I really believe that this is one of the great moral challenges, political challenges of our time. I was present at that meeting on the 27th of January 2000 when the leaders of all the European states gathered together in Stockholm and committed themselves to a platform of never again, of continuing Holocaust education and anti-racist legislation. And almost immediately, while this was being said, and said, I have to say in good faith, that while this was being said elsewhere, a new anti-Semitism was being born. Before I can explain the nature of this new anti-Semitism, I have to explain very simply what is anti-Semitism. Having studied it now for many years, I find it very hard to define what anti-Semitism is, because it is not a set of beliefs. It is a set of contradictions. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Jews were hated because they were poor, and because they were rich, because they were communist, and because they were capitalist, because they kept to themselves, and because they got everywhere. Because, said Voltaire, they believe in an ancient and superstitious faith. Because, said Stalin, they are rootless cosmopolitans who believe nothing. Anti-Semitism cannot be understood as a set of beliefs because those beliefs are self-contradictory. The best way of understanding it is to think of it as a virus. A virus is able to afflict the human body, so anti-Semitism is able to inflict and infect the body politic. The really interesting thing about viruses is this. The body has, as its most sophisticated of all mechanisms, something called the immune system, which is able to detect and defeat viruses. How then do viruses survive? The answer is by mutating. And that is what happened after the Holocaust. The virus of anti-Semitism mutated so that it was no longer recognizable as the old anti-Semitism. It is something new and different. And this is consequential because what the West did after the Holocaust was make the greatest attempt any civilization has ever made since Homo sapiens first set foot on Earth at creating an immune system so sophisticated that anti-Semitism would never be possible again. 50 years of Holocaust education, 50 years of anti-racist legislation, 50 years of interfaith dialogue, the most sophisticated immune system. And what happened is that anti-Semitism mutated, and the one that we have lived through is only the third or fourth mutation in more than 2,000 years of history. If I can very simply explain this, in the Middle Ages, Jews were hated for their religion. In the 19th century, anyone know when the word anti-Semitism was actually coined? It was coined in 1879. This is odd because anti-Semitism has been going back a long way. The Haman to Para. So it's clear that in 1879, when a German journalist called Wilhelm Marr coined the word, that something new was being referred to. Jews were no longer being hated for their religion, they were being hated for their race. Today you can't hate anyone for their race, it's not on. And therefore today Jews are hated for their nation state. They're hated for the state of Israel. The new anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, because Israel has now become the synonym for the Jew. Now, it is also fascinating that although it is very easy to hate, it is exceptionally difficult to justify hatred in public. You can't get up in public and just ask people to hate. It is so difficult to justify hatred that anti-Semitism has always had to have recourse to the highest source of authority in the culture at the time. In the Middle Ages, what was the highest source of authority? It was the church, and therefore religion, anti-Semitism took the form of religious anti-Judaism. That's what it was in the Middle Ages. In the 19th century, you could no longer look to the church as the highest form of authority. This was Europe of enlightenment, emancipation, the age of rationalism. What was the highest form of authority in the 19th century? It was science. And so the 19th century racial anti-Semitism was predicated on two disciplines that were believed at the time to be scientific disciplines, although now we can see they were pseudosciences, namely the so-called scientific study of race and something called social Darwinism. That the same process is at work in society as in biology, that the strong survive by eliminating the weak. After Hiroshima, after the factories of death, science was no longer the pristine source of authority it once was. So the question is, what is the highest source of authority in the post-Holocaust age? And the answer is, of course, human rights. That was the global response to the Holocaust, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. And that is why today the new anti-Semitism has to be defended and justified in the language of human rights. And that is why, at one of the key moments when the new anti-Semitism was born, in the notorious Conference Against Racism, United Nations, in Durban, in August 2001, Israel was accused, especially by the parallel sessions of the NGOs, of the 5 cardinal sins against human rights. Israel was accused of racism, apartheid, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and attempted genocide. And believe it or not, these outrageous claims have sometimes persuaded otherwise intelligent minds. I can just share an experience with you. On January 27, 2003, we were taking Holocaust Memorial Day to Edinburgh, 7:30 in the evening. 6 o'clock in the evening, I go live on the BBC 6 o'clock news, their main early evening news program. So I'm thinking they're going to ask, why Edinburgh? What's the theme this year? This is the first question I'm asked live at the first news item on the BBC News. Chief Rabbi, what have you to say to the fact that this year Holocaust Memorial Day is being boycotted by the Muslim Council of Britain because it fails to take account of the ongoing genocide against the Palestinians? My reply was, of course, the Holocaust began by the debasement of language, and you have just given us a perfect example of that. I have never seen an interviewer pull back so fast. But that is the kind of situation that we're in. And the end result, of course, is that we have seen the intellectual equivalent of the karate tactic of using all your opponent's strength against himself. So that today what is being said is that any human being with any sensibility must be against the Nazis, must be shocked by the Holocaust, must believe never again, and therefore we must understand that the new Jews are the Palestinians, the new Nazis are the Israelis, and therefore any thinking, feeling human being must be against the state of Israel. And that is how, by one mutation, you can bypass and defeat the most sophisticated immune system the West has ever known. And that is really tragic. And that ongoing mutation is beginning to affect and infect university campuses throughout the world, including, believe it or not, here in America. Now, this is serious. I cannot tell you how serious this is. Let us be very blunt. In the 19th century, in the age of emancipation, Jews were told in France, in Germany, in Austria, this is the age of emancipation. All you've got to do is become like us, assimilate, integrate, and there'll be no more hatred of the Jews. You won't be different, you'll be like us, and therefore there will be no more hatred of the Jews. So Jews integrated, Jews assimilated, Jews even converted, and still they were hated as Jews. And that was when that new anti-Semitism was born. By the end of the 19th century, after the pogroms in Russia, after the Dreyfus affair in Paris, serious thinking Jews realized that despite all the promises of emancipation and enlightenment, there was not going to be a place for Jews in Europe. And they came to the conclusion, most famously Theodor Herzl, that if Jews were not safe in Europe, they had to leave Europe, go to the Middle East, and return to their land of origins, and thus the great Zionist movement was born. Herzl believed that once Jews had a land of their own, a state of their own, they would be kechol hagoyim, like all the other nations, and anti-Semitism would end. What has happened? Anti-Semitism did not end. Instead, another new form of anti-Semitism has been born. As Amos Oz said, in the 1930s, the anti-Semites were shouting Jews to Palestine. Today they're shouting Jews out of Palestine. He said they don't want us to be here, they don't want us to be there, they don't want us to be. And we cannot allow that to happen. So, the real issue is therefore this, that we have to confront now this further new mutation in anti-Semitism. And that is why I wrote Dignity of Difference, and that is why I wrote Not in God's Name. Because I believe the time has come for us candidly to admit that we cannot make the mistake those who came before us made. And I'm not talking hindsight here. I mean, let me make it absolutely clear. Had I been there at the time, I would have made the same mistake. I would have said what Jews said, which is anti-Semitism is about Jews, it affects us, it's our problem, and therefore we must find a solution. And that, I believe, is a real mistake. It is a mistake because anti-Semitism is not caused by Jews, it merely attacks Jews. Anti-Semitism isn't born among Jews, it's born among the general population. And frankly, if this is a struggle of us against the world, then let us be honest. We're slightly outnumbered here. There are 2.4 billion Christians, there are 1.6 billion Muslims, and there are a few Jews. You know, I don't know how many, most of them seem to be here at the moment. When I became chief rabbi in 1991, knowing that we'd been traveling around the world, a friend presented Elaine and myself with a directory of world Jewish communities, and they had an entry for every country, and it was headed with a statement of the population of the country and the Jewish population of the country. And in 1991, it's absolutely true, the entry for China, it wouldn't read that way now, but in 1991, the entry for China read, China population 1 billion, Jewish population 5. And I showed this to Elena, and I said, if there are 5 Jews in China, I guarantee you 2 things. Number 1, there are 6 synagogues. And number 2, somewhere, someone is saying the Jews are running the country. But for every Jew today, there are 123 Muslims, 185 Christians. We cannot fight this battle alone. In 2003, together with my fellow rabbis around Europe, we persuaded Romano Prodi to convene the first Europe-wide conference on anti-Semitism at the EU headquarters in Brussels. There were well over 1,000 people there. And when I came into the hall and looked at the audience, I was really shocked. Because around 98% of the audience was Jewish. And I thought, this is wrong. We are not the ones who need to know about anti-Semitism. It's the cultures that give rise to anti-Semitism that really need to do this. And so I got up and made a speech, and I said, Jews cannot be left to fight anti-Semitism alone. The victim cannot cure the crime. The hated cannot cure the hate. I fight, and I still do, for the right of Christians to live without fear, their faith without fear anywhere in the world. But I need you Christians to fight for the right of Jews to live without fear anywhere in the world. I led and still lead the campaign in Britain against Islamophobia. But I need you Muslims to be in the lead of the fight against Judeophobia. We succeeded to this extent that in Britain, the fight against anti-Semitism is led by non-Jews. Led from the front by three prime ministers, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron, all of whom were absolute giants in this field. All of whom said in public to the Jewish community, you will never be left to fight anti-Semitism alone. And in Britain, the fight against anti-Semitism is led by the all-party parliamentary group against anti-Semitism, British non-Jewish parliamentarians. They lead the fight. But the problem today is global. And we will not win this fight until we persuade those way outside the Jewish community that this is not just our problem, it is your problem as well. And that is what has now become possible. Because right now, it is not only Jews who are suffering from this new wave of hatred. It's not just Jews who are dying. Christians are being massacred, intimidated, and driven out throughout the Middle East and parts of Asia. In Iran, 15 years ago, there were 1.5 million Christians. Today, 400,000 and falling rapidly. In Mosul, one of the oldest Christian communities in history, there are no Christians left. Those who were there, who were caught, were butchered, beheaded, and crucified for being Christian. In Afghanistan, the last church was burned to the ground in 2010. In Gaza, the last Christian bookseller in Gaza was warned in 2007 by Hamas, close your shop, no more Christian literature in Gaza. Being a committed Christian, he kept his shop open. Hamas then burnt it to the ground and slit his throat. Christians who represented 100 years ago 20% of the population of the Middle East today represent less than 4%. This is the religious equivalent of ethnic cleansing. And let us be very blunt. The majority victims of radical Islamism, of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, the Al-Nusra Front, Islamic Jihad, and all their imitators and replicas, the majority of their victims are fellow Muslims who fall the wrong side of the radical-moderate divide or the Sunni-Shia divide. ISIS has 200 million Shia in its gun sights. And a horrendous confrontation is shaping up between, on the one hand, ISIS, and on the other, Iran and its proxies in Hezbollah and Hamas, with the people being threatened, not just Israel, but for heaven's sake, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. And we still don't know the facts about the airliner, but the suspicions are very clear, and you will see that Britain has cancelled all flights to Sharm el-Sheikh. And so this is rapidly becoming a global issue. The radical Islamists are destabilizing one country after another, not just Syria and Iraq, but Libya, Somalia, Yemen, many parts of Africa, parts of Asia, Pakistan, India, these horrendous destabilization. Lebanon and Jordan are on the brink of being overwhelmed by refugees from Syria. The whole world order is shaking. And of course, some of that is feeding back into Europe. And the reappearance of anti-Semitism in Europe, mainly fed by radical Islamists and their media, their YouTube and their Facebook, and their ability to turn young Muslims into jihadists, sometimes without their parents' knowledge. I cannot tell you how powerless Muslim parents, they come to me and they say, we can't control our own kids. This has now come back to Europe. And frankly, if Europe were to become Judenrein within living memory of the Holocaust, there would be a stain on the record of Europe that not all infinity could erase. I have said very bluntly, if it is not safe to be a Jew in Europe, then it's not safe to be a European in Europe. And Europe has to stand up to this, because it is no longer just our problem, it is all our problem.